Hello, everybody. Welcome to this webinar. Wherever you are, whatever your time it is, it's a great pleasure to have you here. Today, we're going to be talking about a new book published by Dr. Dawoon Jung. The book's called The 1982 Law of the Sea Convention and the Regulation of Offshore Renewable Energy Activities Within National Jurisdiction. And it was published by Brill in their series on legal aspects of sustainable development in September of last year. This event's been co-organised by the Centre for International Law at the National University of Singapore in collaboration with the Australian National Centre for Ocean Resources and Security. And my name is James Harrison. I'm Professor of Environmental Law at the University of Edinburgh. I'm going to be the moderator today. And it's a great pleasure for me to be involved in this event because it marks an important milestone in the academic career of our main speaker. It's Dawoon's first monograph. And I've known Dawoon for quite a long time now. I was the supervisor of her PhD at the University of Edinburgh a few years ago. Dawoon was supervised by myself and the late Professor Alan Boyle. And I know Alan would also have been very proud to have seen Dawoon today celebrating the success of her first academic monograph. Since leaving Edinburgh, Dawoon has had a busy and active academic career. She's been both at the National University of Singapore at the Centre for International Law, where she worked with Professor Beckman, who's another one of our speakers today. And most recently, Dawoon joined UNCLOS at the University of Wollongong as a lecturer in June last year. And that's where she continues to carry on her research in the broad fields of the law of the sea, international environmental law, climate change law, and international shipping. The purpose of today, however, is to hear about Dawoon's most recent work, the one that's just been published. And Dawoon will be presenting for about 10-15 minutes the key findings from her work, and then we'll be joined by three other eminent speakers to discuss the book. I will introduce those speakers as we get to them, but for present purposes, I will be quiet and hand over to our main speaker for the day, Dr. Dawoon Jung. Dawoon, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you, James. Before talking about the book, I would like to express my gratitude to the moderator and commentators. This book is developed based on my PhD thesis at the University of Edinburgh. And as James said, that Professor James Harrison was my PhD supervisor who supported me throughout the PhD journey. And this outcome would not have existed without his help. And commentators Professor Maria das Neves, Professor Robert Beckman, and Professor Kamil Gumet are leading scholars whom I have admired, and it is my great pleasure to discuss my book with these excellent scholars. I also would like to thank my academic home, Centre for International Law, and the Australian National Centre for Ocean Resources and Security for supporting the online book launch. Let me talk about the book briefly. Slides, please. Next slide, please. You may be familiar with this photo. This is an offshore wind farm, which is the most developed marine renewable energy. Offshore renewable energy activities have been rapidly growing as a promising alternative source to tackle climate change and achieve sustainable development. While the generation of energy from water, current, and wind is mentioned in UNCLOS, this technology was not developed at the time when the convention was adopted in 1982. Therefore, various challenges arising from this new technology were not foreseen. First, offshore renewable energy activities may have negative impacts on the marine environment, such as underwater noise pollution, collisions with marine species, and entanglement with submarine cables. Second, the growing size of projects also present challenges. For example, one of the largest offshore wind farm projects in the world consists of the 277 wind turbines. The expansion of offshore renewable energy projects occupies huge marine spaces, and it may cause potential conflicts with existing and future activities taking place in the same areas. And third, there is no global or regional instruments directly dealing with offshore renewable energy activities. It raises the question of whether UNCLOS, which was adopted in 1982, is adequate in regulating new technology such as offshore renewable energy activities. One argument claims a need to adopt a new agreement to regulate offshore renewable energy activities. And there is another criticism that although UNCLOS provides a basic legal framework, the current regulation of offshore renewable energy activities, in particular relating to the protection of the marine environment, remains largely fragmented. In this context, this book examined how UNCLOS has evolved to provide a sufficiently detailed regulatory framework for offshore renewable energy activities, what gaps may remain, and how they should be filled. Next slide, please. This is the outline of the book. I would like to briefly introduce each chapter. In the chapter 2, I explained UNCLOS as a basic legal framework to regulate offshore renewable energy activities. The development of the law of the sea is a process of the compromise between the rights of the coast state in relation to their maritime zones and the interests of other states in the lawful uses of the oceans. UNCLOS was adopted in order to establish a stable legal framework governing all uses of the oceans. As the Constitution for the oceans, the Convention provides a certain degree of flexibility to accommodate new developments in the oceans. Legal mechanisms, including rules of reference, regional rules, treaty interpretation, and soft law were considered to interpret, incorporate, and interact with the relevant instruments for further development of UNCLOS. After examining UNCLOS as a basic legal framework, the book explores the different issues raised by the regulation of offshore renewable energy activities from Chapter 2 to Chapter 6. They include environmental impact assessment, environmental regulation from operations, safety of navigation, and decommissioning. Each chapter highlights how different mechanisms elaborate relevant provisions of UNCLOS. For example, Chapter 3 examines an environmental impact assessment. Article 206 of UNCLOS requires states to assess the potential effects of the offshore renewable energy activities in the planning stage. However, Article 206 does not define the content of an EIA or provide specific procedures. This chapter analyzed the detailed requirements of Article 206 in the context of offshore renewable energy activities by using the general rules on treaty interpretation in the 1969 Vienna Convention on the Law of the Treaties. Chapter 4 explores the regulations on the environmental challenges caused by offshore renewable energy operations after the planning stage, such as construction, operation, maintenance. UNCLOS is the only global treaty to provide a comprehensive international legal framework for the protection of the marine environment, and it is complemented by global and regional instruments. And this chapter clarifies how marine biodiversity-related global and regional instruments such as CBD, CMS, ICRW complement and reinforce the existing provisions of UNCLOS to protect the marine environment from offshore renewable energy operations. Chapter 5 examines how to balance conflicting interests between offshore renewable energy activities and other states' safety of navigation. This chapter deals with routing measures and safety zones, focusing on the effects of the rules of reference. Navigational impact assessment is an interesting development. For Chapter 6, it addresses decommissioning as the last stage of offshore renewable energy activities. The life cycle of offshore renewable energy installations is estimated to be around 20 to 30 years, and the earlier offshore wind farm projects are due to be decommissioned in the coming years. This chapter addressed the relevant rules to supplement UNCLOS provisions relating to decommissioning and dumping. In addition, the last chapter of the book discusses marine spatial planning as a policy tool for the integrated oceans management to deal with the issues arising from offshore renewable energy activities in a comprehensive manner. It highlights that MSP facilitates the implementation of rights and obligations of states under UNCLOS. This chapter also includes a few examples of co-location of offshore renewable energy activities and other activities, such as marine protected areas and commercial fishing. It also addressed the development of MSP at the regional level in a transboundary context. Next slide, please. Here are some key points that I would like to highlight. First, UNCLOS evolved to provide detailed regulations through different mechanisms while maintaining a balance of conflicting interests between the host state and other states. Second, it was criticized that the regulation of offshore renewable energy activities remains fragmented and recommendatory in nature. The absence of global rules and standards to protect the marine environment from offshore renewable energy activities remains the biggest legal gap. However, the analysis of the book shows that these non-binding instruments demonstrate normative interaction and cross-fertilization in the development of effective regulations within the UNCLOS legal framework. And also, offshore renewable energy activities are closely linked to geographical aspects and affected by multiple geological factors, such as speed of wind, seabed conditions, and water column conditions. In this regard, I argue that regional treaty bodies for the protection of the marine environment could provide a more effective forum for the development of comprehensive regulations considering geographical characteristics of the renewable energy activities. Next slide, please. And as you can see from the term offshore renewable energy, the scope of the book covers a broad range of marine renewable energies. It covers not only offshore wind energy, which is currently the most developed marine renewable energy, but also offshore wave, tidal, and geothermal energy activities, which are expected to develop more in the near future. And I also noticed that a number of legal documents use the term marine renewable energy rather than specifying the different energy sources. Therefore, I believe that this book can provide a good guidance on the further development of offshore renewable energy activities, reflecting their similarities. However, of course, the differences of each marine renewable energy should be also researched further. And the last point is that I hope that the book contributes to ensure that offshore renewable energy activities in different countries or regions are developed in a coherent and comprehensive manner within the UNCLOS legal framework. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dawoon. For those of you participating, there'll be an opportunity later on to ask any questions, and we would ask that you pop your questions in the question and answer tab, and hopefully we'll have a bit of time later on to come back to those, and Dawoon will be able to respond. But before we get to that, we have three wonderful discussants to drill down into some of the detail, offer their own perspectives on offshore renewable regulation and maybe pose their own questions for Dawoon. We will start with Dr. Maria Madalena de Neves. She is an associate professor at the Faculty of Law at the Norwegian Centre for the Law of the Sea at the Arctic University of Norway in Tromsø. She teaches law of the sea, energy law, and international trade law, and she's currently the academic director of the LLM program in the law of the sea in Tromsø. Maria, you have about 10 minutes to offer your perspectives on this subject. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much, James, for your introduction. First, let me start by congratulating Dawoon. I think this is a great book. It's a very welcomed contribution to the body of literature on offshore renewable energy, and I did read it with great interest. So congratulations. As for my part of the discussion, you asked me to speak a little bit about the challenges linking offshore renewable energy in a European contexts and issues concerning the protection of the marine environment. So I thought I would focus here mostly on developments at the European Union level. Also because these represent the most ambitious developments worldwide in terms of deploying offshore renewable energy, but also arguably some of the most advanced regulatory efforts when it comes to renewable offshore renewable energy. Which similarly, like we have at the international level, it's also done via a lot of fragmented legal instruments. But also shows very well how, starting from the outset of the international law, particularly law of the sea and also obligations linked to biodiversity protection, the EU has tried to address this problem of, not problem, but this increased deployment of offshore renewable energy. And also as a context, I think it's important to underline that while historically we have had offshore energy activities in Europe for a number of years now, it was really from 2020 when the European adopted its first offshore renewable energy strategy that we have witnessed a significant development of offshore renewable energy projects in Europe in terms of their acceleration, because this was primarily linked with concerns of the European Union's meeting the Paris Agreement's targets for climate change mitigation. But now, since the invasion of the Ukraine by Russia, what we now have is the acceleration very much linked to energy security concerns. And this has underscored just the urgency of developing offshore wind projects in Europe. So much so that last year, member states have agreed on new goals for offshore renewable energy, which are far more ambitious than those initially foreseen in 2020. So just as an example, if we think of the targets for 2030, we're talking about having 111 gigawatts capacity of installed capacity within European seas, which is almost twice as much as originally foreseen. And if we think that in 2022, we only had about 16.3 gigawatts installed, we see that we're going to have to speed up and deploy offshore renewable energy in the European Union 10 times faster if we're going to meet the 2020 goals. But of course, the EU has deployed now a number of regulatory instruments, different measures, has issued specific guidance designed to really accelerate and support the scaling up of offshore renewable activities. Some of these also focus, touch very much on aspects that you highlight in your book. So first of all, starting by strengthening the maritime spatial planning. And here the European Commission has really been urging member states to set aside specific space for offshore renewable energy projects, and also to adopt a multi-use and multi-purpose approach, particularly integrating offshore renewable energy with fisheries and aquaculture. Then also focusing on another element that you discuss in your book, the increase of cooperation within all of the European Union sea basins, not just via the arrangements, the particular arrangements for these sea basins, but also cooperation with the regional seas conventions organization. So we're talking about enhanced cooperation with OSPAR, Helsinki, Barcelona, and Bucharest conventions, and then institution. So, and the idea behind this being that this cooperation, increased cooperation, will indeed facilitate just the development of best practices, harmonized guidelines, better coordination of offshore energy projects, better decision-making process being put in place. So it's another key area that the EU has been pushing. And also very important, but also now a little bit controversial, has been the fast-track permitting of offshore renewable projects. And these have already been targeted in the revised 2023 Renewable Energy Directive, which also cement this presumption of overriding public interest for renewable energy projects, and also exempt in certain circumstances the need for prior environmental impact assessments. So here, if we think of offshore renewable projects, this is going to be significant because it places a limit for permit granting procedures of maximum 2 years or 3 years, with some additional deadlines exceptionally, depending on whether these projects are going to be respectively carried out in identified renewable acceleration areas or not. So it's a very short deadline. And this is quite significant if we think that, for example, the Netherlands, that has the fastest permit tracking within the EU for offshore renewable energy projects, and it's about 4.5 years. And then we think of the opposite, a country like Spain that takes 11 years to permit offshore wind farms. If we're scaling down to 2 or 3 years, this is going to be significant. And it also raises concerns whether is this going to be viable to have such a short deadline for these projects. Because this amount of projected offshore renewable energy projects, these fast-track processes, they do raise a number of concerns with the protection of the marine environment and biodiversity. And even though the European offshore renewable energy policy documents, they do emphasize the need that offshore renewable energy developments must comply with the, the plethora of fragmented relevant environmental legal instruments and integrated maritime policy that the EU has adopted, which all of these tend to promote, the sustainable and healthy use of the marine areas within the European Union. They also focus on, for example, restoration and rehabilitation concerns. But the fact is that all of these instruments, such as the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, the Habitats and Birds Directives, Marine Spatial Planning Directive, and so on, they also very much rely on the implementation by the member states. And here things differ greatly. So the concerns are still valid, because even with all this legislative framework behind it, the effective contribution to the protection of the marine environment, it remains a challenge. So member states have actually failed to achieve the good environmental status in the marine environment within the European marine area. Only about 1.8% of marine protected areas in the EU actually have management plans, and there is very much an unfavorable conservation status across considerable amount of marine species within the European area. So deploying more offshore renewable energy projects without enough time to adequately consider the environmental implications can be problematic. And here the idea is that we cannot try and solve climate change problems and energy security problems by further aggravating the health of the marine environment and biodiversity. And inclusively, I think it's important to also note that September of last year, the European Court of Auditors, which are the external auditors that oversee and address or assess European action, they issued a special report on offshore renewable energy, and they also alerted to the fact that while the EU has ambitious goals in place for offshore renewable energy, the issue of sustainability of these plants remains very much a challenge. So they emphasize that the footprint, that plant installed capacity had not been sufficiently taken into consideration by the European Union, and also the knowledge gaps that exist. And this is also something that you allude in your book very much to, particularly knowledge gaps concerning cumulative environmental impacts needs to be addressed. So, and also they pointed to other shortcomings, to the fact that marine spatial planning was not being actually done properly. And again, the other element that the EU has been focusing, which is cooperation, they also focus that while there is consultation between states within this project, this full proper integrated cooperation still does not exist that much in relation to offshore renewable energy projects. Now, the other aspect that's not alluded in this report, but some environmental organizations have also picked up on, is the fact that the simplification of the permitting procedures and the presumption of overriding public interest have also aggravated concerns with the potential for states to perhaps not pay so much heed to the protection of the marine environment, but rather the desire to implement offshore renewable projects faster. They also argue that this undermines the environmental impact assessment process and also undermines the public consultation within these projects. And as far as I know, to my knowledge, there is at least already one case law, one case filed against European institutions in the European Court of Justice to reflect further on this matter. And I see that I'm running out of time, but perhaps one other aspect is that I've been focusing a lot on the deployment of new offshore renewable energy projects, but now a big topic within the European context, considering that we have a number of older, particularly wind farms that are reaching their end of life, will be the decommissioning of these farms. So, and regulation for the decommissioning, much like we have seen on the international law side of things, has also been very much overlooked also within a European context, but now this has gained traction, and really we are discussing about how to sustainably decommission offshore renewable energy projects, and particularly taking into account also circular economy considerations. So I know that the European Commission is very much also working on updating their study on impacts of decommissioning of offshore installations. So it will be interesting to see more tailor-specific regulatory developments in this aspect of decommissioning, which you also covered very aptly in your book. So we see a lot of fast, ambitious developments in the EU that raise some concerns in relation to environment. There is also a lot of European legislation that is being revised at the moment, so like the Marine Spatial Strategy Directive. So we also see new developments for regulating the commissions. So it's an interesting stage now, and I think we will be able to take a lot of examples from what is being done at European level, perhaps to serve as inspiration to other parts of the world as well. So I'll finish here. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Maria. I think you've raised some really interesting, important points, and we'll maybe ask Dawoon to come back to some of them after we've heard from the other discussants. Next up, we have Professor Robert Beckman, who's already been alluded to several times today. Professor Beckman was the founding director of the NUS Centre for International Law at the National University of Singapore. Currently, it's head of Ocean Law and Policy Programme. He's a well-known expert on the law of the sea, and he has a special interest in ocean law and policy, maritime security, and international regulation of shipping. As I said earlier, Professor Beckman worked closely with Dawoon during her time at CIL, and today he'll be offering his thoughts and comments on her book. Over to you, Professor Beckman.
Thank you very much, James, and congratulations to Dawoon. We miss her here at CIL, but we are confident that she's going to be a very good alumni in one of our many alumni in Anchorage. I've been asked to focus primarily on the issue with respect to shipping and its impact, the impact of offshore wind farms on shipping. I'll say a little bit about the Southeast Asian region as I understand it, in terms of the potential impact for wind farms. With respect to the territorial sea and other archipelagic waters where coastal states have sovereignty, as far as I know, the Philippines is looking at wind farms within their archipelagic waters. They should pose no difficulties so long as they don't obstruct the major sea lanes. Indonesia, again, would have vast archipelagic waters in which to construct wind farms. Foreign ships, of course, would have to comply with the laws and regulations of the coastal state, as well as the generally accepted international regulations. The one difficulty I see with respect to wind farms within the territorial sea in Southeast Asia is that many of the coastal states have been loosely interpreted the provisions on strait baselines. So there could be some issue with respect to whether the wind farms are actually within territorial sea or within economic zone. With respect to wind farms in major sea lanes of communication, again, we have the Straits of Malacca and Singapore as the major sea lane for traffic between the Indian Ocean and South China Sea. I don't anticipate this narrow sea lane. I don't anticipate that any of the three littoral states, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, would plan wind farms within the strait. Therefore, the issue of strait use for international navigation is not a major issue. The one point I guess I would disagree with in the book is that Dawoon mentioned the Taiwan Strait, but I don't believe that is a strait used for international navigation because, as far as I can recall, that its narrowest part is 70 nautical miles between the mainland and Taiwan, and therefore there would be a belt of high seas in the middle. And I think the wind farms that have been put on the Taiwan side would be within their territorial sea. With respect to navigation, I think the major issue as I see it in Southeast Asia is probably not with commercial ships. It's more likely to be with conflict with respect to fishing vessels. The fishing vessels are clearly a major cause for concern with respect to, sometimes with respect to offshore oil installations, very often with respect to submarine telecommunications cables. So I would expect there may be some difficulties with respect to power cables coming from wind farms and with the methods of fishing that are sometimes used by fishermen in this region. Should also point out that in terms of small fishing vessels, I believe that Indonesia alone has more than 600,000 small fishing vessels under its registry. So I anticipate there would be difficulties on wind farms and on the cables from wind farms, as there is with fiber optic telecommunications cables. With respect to economic zone in the region, I should point out that the Law of the Sea Convention did anticipate to a certain extent the development of wind farms because they talked about coastal state having sovereign rights with respect to economic exploitation of the zone, such as the production of energy from wind. So I think someone had their crystal ball as this was negotiated in the 70s. Coastal state has jurisdiction as provided in the convention in the economic zone. With reciprocal due regard obligations between the coastal states and the user state. I expect there may be some difficulties that arise in this area, but I don't anticipate many. I think installation of wind farms in the economic zone, coastal state clearly has the right to construct them, but they must not be established where there'd be interference with recognized sea lanes. I think Dawoon explains these issues very clearly in her chapter on this subject. With respect to the safety zones, I don't anticipate a problem. I see more of a difficulty with, as I said, with respect to the power cables that are coming from those zones. A couple of issues with respect to Southeast Asia that may be unique. I think there will be difficulties with respect to the establishment of wind farms in the South China Sea because of the differences in views between the Southeast Asian countries bordering the South China Sea and China with respect to their claiming of rights within the 9- or now 10- line, which overlaps very, very significantly with the economic zones of Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. The other issue, which is perhaps important in this region, is states like Singapore are going to be are very interested in importing power from neighboring countries from wind farms. And this would raise the issue of the transit, for example, of the cables coming from wind farms in Vietnam down to Singapore would have to pass through the archipelagic waters of Indonesia. Similarly, similar issue with respect to other power coming from Australia. So this would raise issues. Again, as I read the convention, the coastal state has complete, or the archipelagic state has complete right to regulate the cables coming through, power cables coming through their sovereign waters. So that issue of power cables would also raise a potential issue of whether the coastal state would require an economic impact assessment. I guess the final issue that I would raise, and I'd be happy to take questions, would be, we do a lot of work on submarine telecommunications cables, and I see a lot of similarities with respect to the power cables. And I think we're all, over the past year, recognizing the potential impact of the security of offshore underwater infrastructure, and that would include the power cables as well as telecommunications cables. And I expect that that's an issue that at the regional level, the ASEAN countries are going to be taking a look at. So it will not only be the security of the offshore wind farm, but the security of the cables that are connecting that wind farm to the shore. And I would hope that at a regional level, ASEAN could perhaps learn from the experience of Europe and use that as a model for best practice, not only in the establishment of wind farms and the balance with environmental protection, but also as people start worrying about the security of offshore platforms. I'll stop there. I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Beckman. Our third and final discussant today is Dr. Camille Goodman, Associate Professor at UNCLOS and therefore now a colleague of Dawoon. Prior to joining UNCLOS, Camille worked at the Commonwealth Attorney General's Department in Australia in the Office for International Law, and there she provided legal and policy advice on a range of public international law issues, but had a particular focus on law of the sea and international fisheries law. And these are the topics that she has taken up with gusto since she's started her academic career. Today, Camille will be speaking to the issues raised in this book, namely the regulation of offshore energy, one of her many, many expertise. Camille, over to you.
Thanks very much, James. And like the other speakers, I'd like to really congratulate Dawoon on this significant and much needed book, which I purchased as soon as it was published last year. And I'd like to thank her very much for inviting me to participate in this event. It's a real privilege to share a few thoughts on this book, which is a really important and timely contribution to obviously one of the most pressing global challenges that we're dealing with, addressing climate change by supporting the transition to renewable energy. I always find the facts and figures about the potential of offshore renewable energy to be mind-blowing. So I thought I'd start there. Dawoon quotes some of them in her introduction, in particular the IEA estimate that offshore wind alone has the potential to generate 18 times the world's current energy demand. And that figure that she's put really sets the scene for why her book, with its focus on the regulatory framework for developing all of this offshore renewable energy, why it's so important. Clarity about the framework is globally important, but as we've already heard from other speakers, it's also regionally and nationally important. And it's particularly relevant here in Australia. As you probably know, Australia has abundant offshore energy resources, and we have a pressing need to find replacements for our offshore oil and gas, both in terms of energy security and economic security. But the development of a regulatory framework to underpin offshore renewable energy and thus enable us to develop an industry has lagged far behind the other countries we've been hearing about. So it's particularly beneficial for Australia that not only has Dawoon written this book, but she's come to live and work in Australia, where her knowledge is already a great addition to our ranks at UNCLOS. We've benefited from the expertise reflected in this book through her contributions to a number of projects and submissions we've been working on, including through our Blue Energy Futures Lab, relating to ongoing proposals from our government to locate an offshore renewable energy zone off the coast of our university, in fact, in Wollongong. So as my contribution to celebrating Dawoon's book, I'd like to make some brief observations about its role and relevance from two perspectives. First, I want to note how useful this book will be for governments. Having worked, as James mentioned, for many years advising the Australian government on the development, implementation and interpretation of international law, I feel that I can confidently say that Dawoon's book provides a detailed and helpful roadmap for understanding the contemporary legal framework for regulating offshore renewable activities in the EEZ. And that's going to be extremely valuable to practitioners and policymakers, as well as academics. I think that by asking, as you saw on her slides, by asking whether UNCLOS has provided a sufficiently detailed regulatory framework for offshore renewable energy, Dawoon set up an inquiry which not just allows her, but requires her to explore and explain all the relevant sources that could be considered to contribute to that regulatory framework. And her book delivers hugely on that front. Not only does it analyse the relevant provisions of UNCLOS in the context of all the relevant contemporary literature and practice, but it gives us a wide-ranging and detailed examination of other treaties, commentaries, guidelines, cases and comparisons which can be drawn on to inform and influence how we interpret and apply the rules in UNCLOS. And at the same time, it makes careful distinctions about the role and legal status of these different things. This sort of examination in the book is invaluable to policymakers and government lawyers. It's sort of like a one-stop shop. You can find out what the law is and what the law isn't, what the minimum standards are, and what best practice approaches would suggest if you want to do more than the minimum. And you can find that all in one place. And the book does it in a way that is thorough and thoroughly referenced. So you can feel confident in relying on it because it's well referenced, but you can easily go and look at the primary sources to explore them further for yourself, as most of us like to do. There's lots of examples of this. I'll just focus on one, which struck me in chapter 3, where Dawoon explores the meaning of the obligation in Article 206 of UNCLOS regarding the conduct of EIAs, and she referred to it herself in her remarks. Noting that there is no global or regional treaty dealing with EIAs for offshore renewable energy, she then goes and looks forensically at what other sources could be drawn on to fill in the gap, from the CBD to things I hadn't heard of, the ESPU Convention, and to UNEP goals, to principles, ILC draft articles, guidelines adopted by other treaty bodies, and relevant jurisprudence. And she provides detailed information about the standards that you could draw from these sources and draws conclusions about what they mean in terms of what is required to fulfill the obligation of conducting an EIA in the context of renewable energy. So I think this combination of concise but detailed summary of the contemporary requirements of international law with these careful and comprehensive references will be of great value to practitioners and policymakers around the world, whether they're advising governments or indeed international and regional bodies or industry or civil society. Secondly, I'd like to speak about the role and relevance of this book from an Australian perspective, so please indulge me. As I've already mentioned, although Australia is richly endowed with offshore energy potential, our regulatory framework for offshore energy production is very new. It entered into force less than 2 years ago, and we're still at an early stage of declaring which areas are suitable for offshore energy infrastructure and considering the grant of the first feasibility licenses for studies. So we have a long road ahead of us here in terms of designing and implementing an effective and a legally sound framework for all the issues raised so methodically in this book, from EIAs to the prevention of marine pollution, the protection of biodiversity, and ultimately to that chapter on refurbishing or renewing or removing or repurposing offshore energy infrastructure, all of which seems far away right now when we don't have any offshore energy developments. So in this respect, Dawoon's book is a rich source of inspiration for Australia, I think, and some of her ideas struck me particularly strongly as relevant to the Australian context. So again, I'll just give one example, and again, it's from chapter 3 in that discussion about EIAs. And here I noticed in particular the discussion about public participation in EIA processes as a question of international law. Dawoon notes that there's no indication of a requirement of public participation in Article 206 of UNCLOS or in the ICJ jurisprudence, but then she goes further and draws on examples from the guidance provided in other conventions, such as OSPAR, and she also looks at state practice to show that public participation should perhaps be considered as one of the main elements of an EIA for offshore renewable energy. And this is highly relevant in Australia, where there's already been significant angst and unrest in the public about the perceived lack of consultation or lack of information, even just at the stage of declaring suitable offshore areas for the conduct of these activities. So the idea of considering public consultation as part of an EIA requirement is really interesting. There's a lot of interesting themes in Dawoon's book which could be commented on and on which it would be interesting to hear more. One idea I was intrigued by was the suggestion in chapter 2 that the concept of a region does not necessarily relate to geographic co-location, but that a region could perhaps be characterized in other ways by reference to other criteria, perhaps physical, ecological, or political. It'd be great to learn more about what role that sort of approach to the concept of a region might play in relation to the regulation of offshore renewable energy and in relation to where we take our ideas and influences from. Another thing that would be good to discuss is the idea raised in chapter 7 about marine spatial planning being a method of implementing due regard. And then there are the critical themes which recur throughout the book, the balance of interests that's embedded in UNCLOS, the requirements of due diligence, and I think the importance of and the variety of mechanisms that can be used for interpretation and evolution in treaty law, and particularly in UNCLOS, with respect to different issues in UNCLOS requiring different forms of interpretation to help you with them. But time is short, so let me just conclude with my favourite offshore renewable energy statistic, which is that the total global capacity of offshore wind has been doubling every 3 years. So in 2013, we had only 7 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity worldwide. In 3 years, that had doubled to 14 gigawatts, and in another 3, it doubled again to 28. By the end of 2022, there was 63 gigawatts of offshore wind installed worldwide. And this trend is on track to continue with another 130 gigawatts of offshore wind expected to be added between 2023 and 2027. Or even more, depending on how Europe fulfills those targets that Maria mentioned. So not only is Dawoon's book on offshore renewable energy important and timely, but you could argue that it becomes twice as important every 3 years. So hopefully that also means it will sell twice as many copies every 3 years, and the second edition will be coming sooner rather than later, with lots more practice and requirements to fill it out. So I'm really looking forward to that. Congratulations, Dawoon.
Thank you very much, Camille. Lovely way to finish. So I would remind the audience, we might have about 5 minutes for questions at the end. So if you do have any questions for Dawoon or one of the panelists, you can pop them in the Q&A section. But I would like to give Dawoon just a couple of minutes to respond to the comments of the three discussants. Lots of interesting issues raised: fast-track permitting, participation, transit of power cables through neighboring states, and the other one, security issues, big issue in this part of the world right now for offshore wind. So a couple of reflections from you, Dawoon.
Thank you, James, and thank you, commentators. I'm really grateful to have you for today's seminar and today's event. I asked commentators in advance that whether they can kindly share their experiences from the different regions, and then here are so many interesting and insightful comments. As for the Maria's comments, thank you so much for sharing your experience in Europe. In fact, I always thought that Europe is the front runner in the development of the renewable energy activities. And then even though now China is the biggest market in terms of development of the offshore wind farms, still EU regulations have a lot of things to learn from the outside. And I just only look at the global and regional instruments and how they interact each other within the UNCLOS legal framework. But it will be very interesting to see how EU directives interact each other and how they implement it at the national level as well. And as for the issue of the protection of the marine environment, we can talking about the for a couple of hours. And I do agree with you that it is also important to develop the regulations at the fragmented nature, at the current stage of the fragmented nature. But at the same time, it is also important to implement these regulations. As for the decommissioning, I have to admit that in fact, there are not many literature focusing on the offshore wind farm or offshore renewable energy activities. So I just look at the regulations relating to oil and gas energy activities. And then I believe that in principle, the basic principles will be very similar, but the size of the number of turbines or the number of installations will be huge different from the oil and gas energy activities. So I think this is definitely an issue that we need to look at and develop more. As for Prof. Beckman's comments, thank you so much. And yes, it's very interesting to see the unique characteristics of the Southeast Asia. And I do agree with you that fishing vessels can be more threats than the commercial shipping in this region. But I think there are a couple of examples in Europe to develop the cable protection zone in terms of the offshore wind farm. And I think this can be a good example that Southeast Asian countries can consider to develop more. And as for the navigational issues, navigation impact assessment is a very interesting development at the IMO. And even though it was developed by the IMO resolution, which was non-binding resolution, but it was incorporated and developed in the national legislation at in a couple of countries. So I think to make a balance between the conflict interest of the right to exploit offshore renewable energy and the safety of navigation, the navigation impact assessment can be a good tool to consider to develop more. And as for the security against the infrastructure, Camille and I are working on this issue, and we hope to finish this article by this year. And we will look at the security issues against maritime infrastructure, focusing on the offshore wind farm and cable, focusing on the Southeast Asia and Asia Pacific region. So I believe that this article can be a good answer to your question. And as for comments, kind comments, thank you so much. And I feel that I'm quite lucky to move to Australia at the most important time in terms of development of offshore renewable energy activities. My background is the Wollongong, and this region is Illawarra region. And then there is the announced that there is the potential development of the huge development of the offshore wind farm project in this region. And I was quite lucky enough to be part of the university community called Blue Energy Future Lab at the University of Wollongong, and I was part of the submission for the consultation process. And it was so interesting to learn how local community or how people respond and react to the announcement. And I was I also learned quite a lot from this network at the university, because not only lawyers but also people are in economy and social science and engineering department. We gather together and talk about all different kinds of issues. So if you are interested in the development of the offshore wind farm in the Illawarra region, please check out the Blue Energy Future Lab at the University of Wollongong. And I believe that you will find a lot of interesting literature that developed by my colleagues at the University of Wollongong. I think I can talk about this issue, Andres, but I think because time limit, I will stop now. And James, over to you.
We've not had any questions in the chat yet, but I would just like to ask you, you've obviously put a huge amount of work into this book over many, many years, and it's a wonderful achievement. But, you know, as a former supervisor, I'm always wanting to know what you're going to do next. So what's the next kind of steps in offshore energy regulation that you think are important? Where do you see kind of the legal research in this area having to move to in the next couple of years, given the growing importance of the sector, as Camille's highlighted?
Thank you so much, James. And it reminds me of the PhD viva. But I still feel that offshore renewable energy activities have quite a lot of the regional characteristics because of the geopolitical aspects. So I would be more, but as for this book, I just wanted to have the outcome, to have the comprehensive perspective on the regulation of offshore renewable energy activities within the UNCLOS legal framework. But I will be more interested in the how to develop very specific regulations at the regional level. And as for the protection of the marine environment, Europe is a very good example that they have the EU directives, but also the OSPAR or HELCOM provides very good leading examples to develop the regulation as well as best practices as well. And also, they also working very closely together to collect data together on the what kind of impacts that offshore wind farm raise the marine ecosystem in that region. But as for the Asia, I feel that it is also one of the biggest gap. So I would be very interested in working on how to develop these regulations in focusing on the Asia region.
So in a sense, it's about you've provided the broad overview of the general legal framework, and now it's about thinking about how to make that work specifically in practice, taking into account regional characteristics.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I think we are coming to the end of the session, and so I will fulfill my duties as moderator by thanking all of our discussants for taking part in today's event, and reiterating the congratulations to Dawoon for a fantastic book, and encouraging everybody to go off and visit their local bookstore or go online and get a copy, because clearly it is essential reading for anybody interested in the regulation of offshore renewable energy activities. So thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you to the organisers, and thank you to discussants, and most of all, thank you for Dawoon for the hard work that you've put into both the book and today's presentation of it. Great.